Merkel Media.
I'm exhausted, looking for everything in the shadows. Start looking at people like they don't matter. I'm waking up to the fact, more than a little bit shallow. I'm lost in this hole, but I don't wanna. I'm lost in this hole, 'cause I'm just trying to
What's good, guys? We are back with part 3 and the finale of the Nephilim Portal Babies theory, and it's all going to come together. Everything we talked about in episode 1, where we broke down the origins of the Nephilim. Then we went into episode 2, where we talked about Evil Enoch and the craft legends of Freemasonry, which rolled right into the Brotherhood of the Snake. And today, we're going to culminate it all with some very interesting concepts. And at the end of this, I'll break down my theory and how all of these different pieces, I believe, come together to showcase what they are doing here in the modern era with concepts that were talked about thousands of years ago. And today we're going to start with the idea of the homunculus. And a good friend of mine, Juan Ayala, was the guy that put me on this concept several years ago. And I've done some more digging myself into how this is integrated into this Nephilim Portal Baby theory. And we're going to talk about the origins of the homunculus, when it was first talked about, and how it trickles into what I think is the modern version of the homunculus or moonchild. And we're going to talk about that here in a little bit. But for people that don't know, homunculus stands for little person, or homunculi is the plural of homunculus, and it is a small artificial human or human-like being. And this was really brought to the forefront in the 16th century in alchemical circles, and historically, it's referred to as the creation of a miniature, full-formed human or humanoid being. So the ability for man to create a humanoid, a miniature version human, without using the normal processes of creating a human being between a man and a woman. And you'll see that those two are used in different versions of how to create these homunculi, but it is the idea that man can become God, that can do godlike things that only Yahweh, only God himself can perform. So it does have its roots in preformationism, and that's important to talk about too, because preformationism was the idea that we and animal kind, when the sperm is injected into the egg, the sperm itself is a miniature version of what it will eventually grow to be. So say myself, who was the sperm that made it. I look like me. I was just a microscopic version of that. Now, we know that not to be true now, but back then, this was the idea, and it was called the spermist theory. And the first guy to really bring that to the forefront was Pythagoras. And I'm sure people have heard of Pythagoras in these Gnostic, occult, and alchemical circles. But Pythagoras was a Greek philosopher, polymath, and the founder of Pythagoreanism. And we're not going to get into Pythagoreanism today, but that spawns out into a lot of different occult circles. And just for people to know I bring up the word polymath a lot. Polymath, in layman's terms, is someone who has knowledge that spans into many different subjects. So when they're trying to solve a problem, they can draw from all of these different areas that they are masters of. It is the opposite of the jack of all trades, master of none. It's literally the jack of all trades, master of all, is what a polymath is. And you'll see a lot of these geniuses throughout history were polymaths, and Pythagoras was one of those. And he was the first one to really bring the idea of spermism. And it's the idea that the fathers contributed most of the essential characteristics and the mothers only contributed material substrate, which we now know that in the general sense isn't true. Now, Aristotle came along later on, and he brought a little bit different idea to spermism that was a little more complex, and then that got passed down to Galen. We're going to talk a little bit about Galen today too as well, because this all fits into this homunculi theory. But really the main individual that brought the homunculus, the word homunculus, to us was Paracelsus. And I've talked about Philippus, Areolus, Theophrastus, Bombastus, von Hohenheim many times on the show. As a matter of fact, if you haven't heard me talk about him, I did a 2-part series on the elementals of Paracelsus, so go back and check that out. What's up, guys? Real quick before we jump back into the show, for people who have been asking how to support the show financially, you can support in a few ways. First, you can become a member here on YouTube. We have 3 different tiers and custom emojis for you to use on this channel. You can also go to buymeacoffee.com/freetherabbits and become a monthly member or make a one-time donation. If you're looking for some great merch to wear this fall and winter, like our new Faith Turns Promise into Prophecy and I'm a Free Range Rabbit merch, go to freetherabbits.myshopify.com for tons of options, and we're always updating the store with new items. And lastly, for anyone looking for any of the films that I've been in, like Expedition Dogman, Sasquatch and the Missing Man, or our brand new film, The Meadow Project, head over to merkelfilms.com to stream them now. All right, guys, let's get back into the show. And the homunculus first appears in name as homunculus in the alchemical writings attributed to Paracelsus. And we know Paracelsus to be the father of toxicology. And that is essential to modern medicine today. And toxicology, for people that need to understand what that concept is, it's the discipline overlapping with biology, chemistry, pharmacology, and medicine that involves the study of adverse effects of chemical substances on living organisms. So say if someone gets poisoned, then because of toxicology, we would understand what kind of antidote to give them. Now, that's not the only thing Paracelsus studied by any stretch, but that was one of his main contributions to the world of medicine. But one of the things Paracelsus was at the root core was an alchemist, a Gnostic, an occultist, and he was considered a prophet or diviner, and many of his prognostications were studied by the Rosicrucians in the 17th century, which I also talked about in the Elementals of Paracelsus. And I talked about how that the Rosicrucians, for one, claimed to see these elemental beings, and also they vowed chastity. This group of early Rosicrucians, they vowed this chastity in hopes of marrying an elemental, which I find interesting. And that will play a part today when we're talking about the intermingling and even marriage of these beings and humankind and what comes out of that. And one of the things Paracelsus brought to modern medicine, and you're going to find this funny because modern medicine doesn't, at least on the outside, claim this, but one of the things that he developed was this unique philosophy, and it rejected the original Galenic medicine of his time, and it embraced this new vision of healing rooted in alchemical principles. So he believed that the universe was a living organism, and it was permeated by a divine intelligence, which I don't disagree with being permeated by divine intelligence. Now, it being itself a living organism, possible, right? It makes me think of Marvel comics and movies with Ego, the planet that was actually a living planet. Now, it's an interesting concept. I don't know if I buy into the fact of quote unquote Mother Nature and the idea that it's an actual living organism. I believe living organisms are all over it and inside of it, but it really gets into this Gnostic territory. And he would talk about how health was the harmonious balance of substances within the body, and that disease was the result of chemical imbalances of external spiritual forces rather than humoral disorders. I think we have to look at it with a balance, right? I think that, yes, on the one hand, that is true to an extent. People can become ill and become sick because they have some sort of spiritual affliction, but I don't think that's in all cases. And I think that's why, honestly, that Galenic medicine is still around. And Elias Galenus, and he was a Roman and Greek physician, surgeon, and philosopher. His version looked at the four qualities, the elements, air, earth, fire, water, and he linked it to qualities hot, dry, cold, wet. So say if you had an affliction like a cold, he would use something hot to try to dispel that cold, right? So not in all cases that works, clearly, because Paracelsus came along later with toxicology and realized that there is room for pharmaceuticals and medicines, which I completely agree with too. Now, I do agree that there's plenty of things we can do to keep our bodies healthy, that we don't need to go that route. I'm not saying that it's all bad when it comes to pharmaceuticals, but I can say that there is a push through the pharmaceutical companies to make us dependent on them. And when it comes to Galenic medicine, his biggest contribution is active drugs that we use in usable forms like tablets, creams, etc., and making them safe and effective for delivery. And that's very vital today in techniques that we use in modern medicine. So again, not everything was thrown out when Paracelsus came along. It's just that Paracelsus had some other contributions that were more influential now into modern medicine. But his biggest thing was the marriage between the spiritual and the physical. In a lot of respects, I agree with that too. And alchemy during that period, when Paracelsus was around, merged the experimental technique with metaphysical speculation. So a lot of what Paracelsus and other alchemists at the time were rooted in were Hermetics, Neoplatonism, and Christian esoteric traditions. So during this Renaissance, alchemy pursued the transformation of both matter and the soul. And the idea of ancient alchemy, this transforming base metals into gold, could also be used to purify the human body and restore health. So his idea was, hey, what we're doing to transmute these metals into more precious metals, we can do with the body as well. And I'm not denying that alchemists were doing that. And to some extent, that's where the basis of modern medicine came from. Whether modern medical practitioners want to admit that or not, the entire medical field is based on alchemy. And one of Paracelsus' key innovations was his redefinition of the role of the alchemist. He likened the alchemist to Christ himself, acting as a mediator between the celestial and terrestrial realm. So here we go again with this very Gnostic ideology that the alchemist is like Christ, is Christ consciousness. We can all become Christ. And Paracelsus was at the forefront of that. And he saw the alchemical process as a spiritual and physical one, and it was a sacred science to him. And to be able to perform the type of alchemy that a elite level alchemist would need to, according to Paracelsus, would need to have a perfected soul. Just like when metals are transmuted and now the metal has become perfected when it's turned into gold or silver, your soul would also have to be spiritually attuned as well and morally pure. So it kind of, again, lends to this Gnostic idea that we are killing the ego, right? But at the same time, if you think that you can perfect yourself, I also believe that you are boosting your ego. So I don't think that it's actually working. I think you're doing the opposite of it. And we're going to see as we're talking more about Paracelsus here and what he thought, that's exactly what he thought. He thought that the hidden mysteries, the arcana, was only available to a special select few. So his contribution to the homunculus, which is the first contribution. Now, not technically the first, because we're going to talk about what Carl Jung thinks about that too, when it comes to Zosimos of Panopolis, but this is the first usage of the word homunculus. And this came from Paracelsus. This came from De Natura Rerum, which means of the nature of things. It was written in 1537. And he actually outlines the method for creating a homunculus. And he says that the sperm of a man be putrefied by itself in the sealed cucurbit. Now, a cucurbit, for people that don't know, is of the gourd family. So when we're thinking about squash, pumpkin, zucchini, we could even throw in watermelon, cucumbers, melons, any kind of melons, right? Those would be in this cucurbit family, the gourd family. Now, most people believe that the sealed cucurbit that he's talking about is a glass vessel, but to get an idea of what it would look like, the cucurbit is of the gourd family. And he says that you take the sperm and you put it in this sealed cucurbit for 40 days with the highest degree of putrefaction in a horse's womb. Now, the word in Latin is venter equinus, and it means horse's womb. However, is also translated to horse manure. So the idea is that the cucurbit that's holding the sperm of a man, it is sealed in this horse's dung. And some people believe it's actually the horse's womb, that you're just using an empty womb that's being pulled out of a horse too. So it's a little bit up for debate on what that exactly means. But the belief is that if it's the horse's dung, it's going to be warm, at least long enough for life to come alive inside of this cucurbit. And this time, it's going to look like a man, but it's going to be transparent without a body. But if it's fed and it's nourished up to 40 weeks and be kept in an even heat of horse's womb, a living human child grows therefrom, with all its members like another child, which is born of a woman, but much smaller. So this miniature man, this homunculus, your own creation, that you only need sperm and this cucurbit and either the horse's womb or horse's dung, this venter equinus that you would place it in. Again, it's a little bit up for debate on whether it's one or the other or both. So the instructions from Paracelsus for creating this homunculus are very detailed and very alchemically specific. And the idea of it being buried in this pile of horse's dung or this horse's womb for 40 days is actually biblical. And that does tie into the idea that Paracelsus was this Gnostic Christian, because the reliance on the number 40, and it's talked about plenty of times in the Bible, it reinforces the symbolic dimension of the experiment. And the reference to the human blood alludes to the vitality and sacredness of blood in both Christian and alchemical traditions. So we can look at the Great Flood. Rain fell for 40 days and 40 nights. We know that Moses spent 40 days and nights on Mount Sinai, and also subsequently the Israelites were wandering in the wilderness for what? 40 years. We know that the spies in Canaan explored the promised land for 40 days. We know in Judges and Kings, there was periods of rest or oppression, often lasting 40 years. We know that Elijah traveled 40 days to Mount Horeb. We know Jonah warned Nineveh judgment for 40 days. We know Jesus fasted and tempted in the wilderness for 40 days. So my take on that is I believe that it's just the alchemical inversion again, this Gnostic occult tradition of taking something biblical and twisting it into something negative, which I do not believe that the homunculus is anything good at all. And I do not believe that Paracelsus was a Christian by any stretch of the imagination, as much as he tries to claim that he is. And I talked about that in the Elementals of Paracelsus. He leans heavily on the New Testament for a lot of things, but again, cherry picking verses to fit his idea. And also, he believes in the arcana of the Bible, that he is finding these hidden blinds that are within the Bible, which I do not believe exist. And if they are being presented that way, I believe it is a falsification that's meant to deceive us. Now, to the idea of the Gnostic occultic point of view that always comes up, Paracelsus cautions in this creation of the homunculus, when it comes to the divine, quote unquote, undertakings of the alchemist, he cautions that only the pious, virtuous, and divinely inspired alchemist could undertake such an operation successfully. Of course, you have to be special. You have to be the chosen one to be able to do that. He believes that the creation of life outside God's will by an unworthy or impure operator is risking producing monstrosities or spiritual perversions. So wait a minute, Paracelsus. So you're saying that you can create life outside of God, but with his will, which is clearly against anything that's in the Bible, trying to mimic who God is. But then he says that if you do it without his will, then you're going to create these monsters. Well, you already create monsters. You're already creating this homunculus that's devoid of a man and woman, which we're seeing today. That's going on in vitro fertilization and ecto labs, which was talked about 2-3 years ago, where they're suggesting that they can create, which I would say would be moonchildren or homunculus babies without the process of a man or a woman. So again, none of this is Christian at all. Now, what Paracelsus talked about, the homunculus did influence people like Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. And Goethe was also a polymath, and he was widely regarded as the most influential writer in the German language. And he was in the late 1700s to early 1800s. And he talked about the homunculus being created in his Faust Part 2. And we also know Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is clearly talking about a homunculus as well. And that was influenced by Paracelsus too. Now, if we look at the psychoanalytic terms of Carl Jung, and for people that don't know who Carl Jung is, he was a Swiss psychiatrist, psychotherapist, and psychologist. And he founded the School of Analytical Psychology. And he worked along guys like Sigmund Freud and Alfred Adler. And his take on alchemy and Gnosticism, the occult, was different than a lot of other people, because he believed that a lot of this was in the mind, but the mind could manifest these things into being true. His ideas on UFOs and all of these different archetypes that he brings up. And I know I've talked about the archetypal language that he's used specifically when we're talking about some of the things that Crowley and Rodi Minor saw in the astral. Now, Carl Jung interprets the homunculus as a symbolic expression of inner transformation and individuation, essentially the spiritual child of the alchemical union of opposites. That really made me think of Aleister Crowley and his spiritual son, C.S. Jones, and that originally Crowley was trying to create a real moonchild, a real spiritual successor to him through all these different scarlet women and prostitutes. And then he had this vision that it would be a spiritual son and that C.S. Jones was to be his spiritual son. So that also ties into this Jungian idea of the spiritual child born of this union of opposites, born of something metaphysical and not of something physical. So basically, according to Jung, it's a metaphor for creation, transgression, and transformation. So essentially what C.S. Jones did when he joined the Thelema religion underneath Crowley and then helped to purvey the OTO into the United States, or at least tried to. Now, Jung also talks about, even though the word homunculus wasn't used, but the concept actually first appeared in the Visions of Zosimos, which was written in the 3rd century AD. And the writer of that would be Zosimos of Panopolis, who I've talked about in this show too. And he was one of the very first alchemists that we know about. And he wrote the oldest known books on alchemy, which are called the Meta. And in the Greek, it means things made by hand. And there were pieces of this work that have survived in the original Greek language. And there are translations also in the Syriac or Arabic. And in this Visions of Zosimos, Zosimos encounters a priest who changes into the opposite of himself, into a mutilated anthroparion. And in the Greek, anthroparion is similar to homunculus. It's a diminutive form of a person, so a smaller man. So this priest changes into the opposite of himself. The opposite of himself becomes this little man, this mutilated homunculus. And even in this dream, Zosimos encounters other of these homunculus. There's no mention of it being created into artificial life outside of when the priest changes, but that would be more of a metaphysical change. But the idea of the change into a smaller human was there. And that, according to Jung, was kind of our first example of that in the Visions of Zosimos. But to even tie this further with Zosimos into what we're really going to talk about at the root core, and man, I'm telling you, I don't know what it is when you start reading the older alchemists, the older occultists, the older Gnostics, very much like the last episode where we were looking at Legends of the Craft and we were looking at some of the original Legends of the Craft. They were talking about things way different than the modern Freemasons talking about it, specifically when it came to Enoch, this good version of Enoch that they have now brought into their craft legends, which was originally the evil Enoch, son of Cain. It's very similar here. We look at Zosimos, and he talks about his first definitions of alchemy, the study of the composition of water's movement, growth, embodying and disembodying. Listen to that word, disembodying, drawing the spirits from the bodies and bonding the spirits within bodies. So drawing the spirits from bodies and bonding the spirits with bodies, these disembodied spirits, is very interesting. You say, well, he's just using verbiage of what he thinks these spirits are. Well, no, he actually tells you exactly what he thinks these spirits are. So he asserts that fallen angels, and I'm telling you right now, he says fallen angels taught the arts of metallurgy to the women they married. And he got these ideas from the Book of Enoch and the Gnostic Apocryphon of John. And George Senkelis, who was a Byzantine chronicler, he has a fragment preserved of Zosimos, and Zosimos actually says verbatim, the ancient divine writings say that the angels became enamored of women and descending taught them all the works of nature. For them thereof is the first tradition, Chema, concerning these arts, for they called this book Chema, and hence the science of chemistry takes its name. I'm telling you now, when you look at what the original purveyors are talking about, they are talking about this in a language that we find very parallel to what's being talked about in the Bible, very parallel to what's being talked about in the Book of Enoch. And again, this is the first purveyor of alchemy. We're talking about the alchemist, Zosimos of Panopolis. And he is saying that alchemical traditions and chemistry come from fallen angels who were enamored of women. So again, I love it when people try to change it up in the modern world about what it is, and they just gloss over what these ancient occultists, ancient Gnostics, and ancient alchemists were trying to tell us all along. Now, according to Paracelsus, a fully grown homunculus was supposedly greatly skilled with art and could actually create other beings, dwarves, giants, and other wild chimera. And it's through art that these things are actually created. So the idea that the homunculus could be a divinator or a creator themselves with magical practices was talked about by many, many occultists throughout history. And we know even in Rosicrucian writings, like the Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosencreutz, and we know that the Rosicrucians were heavy on Paracelsian literature. And this was attributed to Johannes Valentinus Andre, and he was a German theologian. And in this writing, actually concludes with the creation of a male and female form identified as the homunculi duo. And it talks about that the ultimate goal of alchemy, the generation of an artificial human. So the creation of homunculi represents the spiritual regeneration of the Christian. Again, Rosicrucians, the Rosy Cross, they try to mesh into this weird Gnostic Christian viewpoint. But even in that, which is one of the main three manifestos of the Fraternity of the Rosy Cross, it talks about that is the ultimate goal of alchemy, is to create artificial humans as well. And I find that absolutely mind-blowing. But again, it's been talked about for a long time. I don't think that the goal or the end goal has changed in modern times. We're just dressing it up with a very modern take on it. I don't know if you know this, but the homunculus is actually in the Guinness Book of World Records. You can look this up. Go to the Guinness Book of World Records.com and you'll find this, and I'll read this directly from the Guinness Book of World Records. Homunculi were living human-like entities reputedly created during medieval times by alchemists from various organic secretions and other biological substances, as well from certain mystical elements such as the arcanum of human blood. They were usually very small, but the largest on record measured roughly 30 centimeters tall. 8 in number, these were allegedly created during the 16th century by Count Johann Ferdinand von Kufstein, and he was supposedly an 18th century Australian nobleman, and he was known in occult circles for creating 10 homunculi, these tiny human-like beings with prophetic abilities, and he kept them in glass jars in his Vienna Masonic Lodge. And he created these with Abbe Geloni, and Abbe Geloni was an Italian cleric, and they would allow people of notable positions to come and view these homunculi. But if they were released from their sealed jars, they would immediately die if exposed to the air. As a matter of fact, one of them ends up escaping and dies at once. And they said that the remains were buried on the grounds of Kufstein's Tyrolean residence. This is all in the Guinness Book of World Records. So it's in the Guinness Book of World Records for the largest number of homunculi that someone had. So these 8 in number were the most known. And this is in the Guinness Book of World Records. So you have to ask, why is this in the Guinness Book of World Records for so long if there's no truth to it? Which I believe there was. And essentially, they would use these, and Kufstein, according to this lore, would use these to divinate for people to give out prophecies. And you can also find this tale documented in Dr. Emil Bazenzi's Die Phoenix in this Masonic text. And you can look this up. It's the story of Kufstein, and these homunculi are in there as well. So not only is it in the Guinness Book of World Records, it's in Masonic and esoteric lore too. So now we'll move into the Kitab al-Nawamis, which stands for the Liber Vitae in the Latin, and in the English, Book of the Cow. And it is an Arabic book of magic written in the late 19th century. Now, it claims to be written by Plato himself. Generally, you'll see pseudo-Plato there. We don't know. I tend to think probably not, but then again, we don't really know because the versions that we get are in Arabic, and it's an Arabic translation. So this comes from this group called the Sabians of Haran, and they're a religious group, and they're actually mentioned 3 times in the Quran, and they're a Gnostic group. And they're similar to the Mandeans, the Manichaeans, the Archontics, all these different Gnostic sects. They were a Gnostic group too. And this is where that this Liber Vacay, Book of the Cow, this Kitab al-Nawamis comes from. Now, it's a very interesting text. It's about 45 to 40 chapters per 2 books, and each chapter contains a magical experiment or recipe, and it's all about creating these hybrids or phenomena in the sky that you can control the rain, or you can control trees, you can retrieve wisdom, you can see spirits, you can make animals submissive, you can manipulate fire, all of these very magical, alchemical, occult things that is in the Liber Vacay. And we're going to talk about one of the recipes, and we won't go into super detail there because people can just go look it up if they want to. We're just going to talk about the general description of what they say on how to create a homunculi. You're going to need a magician's semen, a sunstone, which would be a mystical elixir, animal blood, a cow or a ewe. You need sulfur, a magnet, and a large glass or lead vessel, and you need some iron. And essentially what you end up doing, and it's pretty graphic, so I'm not going to get into the details per se, but basically you're going to take this animal carcass and you're going to place this magical semen inside of this glass or lead vessel, inside of this carcass, and you're going to sew it up. Essentially, there's a lot more in how to do that. And you're going to feed this cow blood of another animal. And what ends up happening is this unformed substance, this cow will give birth to this unformed substance. And you got to place in this powder, which will cause the blob to grow human skin. And you keep this homunculus in this large glass container for 3 days, and it will become really hungry. So then you have to feed it this blood and of the actual ewe or cow. And then at that point, it'll develop into this grown, tiny, grotesque humanoid with a fragment of a human soul. Now, I'll make that make sense. I don't believe that's true, but I will make it make sense when we talk about Aleister Crowley's version of how to create a homunculus. Again, everybody's got their own version of how to do this, but apparently this version in the Liber Vacay will have a fragment of a soul. Now, it goes a little bit further into what you can form this little man into. There are even animals that you can have it form into as well. An ape, sheep, bovine, so many different things. Or you can keep it as a little man. And again, this is ancient literature that was brought, what we do know from a Gnostic group, the Sabians, attributed to Plato, and how to create this little man. So I mentioned that Aleister Crowley had his own version of that. And I know I've talked about it on the show before. We're going to go a little more in detail today than we have before. Liber 367, De Homunco of the Homunculus. Crowley, and he writes this after he wrote Moonchild, but he tells you that you need to refer to Moonchild because even though Moonchild is a fictional book, which we've talked about plenty of times on the show, it goes into other details that you need to not only read this Liber in the process, but also understand other aspects through this fictionalized work, which is actually according to Crowley. So he talks about the homunculus is a living being in form resembling man, possessing those qualities of man which distinguish him from beast, namely intellect and power of speech, but neither begotten and born after the manner of human generation, nor inhabited by a human soul. So he says, supposing that the reincarnating ego enters the fetus at the 3rd month of gestation, it would not serve to remove such fetus from the mother and cause it to live, for it is already human, but a fetus of 2 months might become homunculus. So what he's saying is there is no soul in the fetus for the first 3 months. What you have to do is implement this soul from somewhere else, and there's this pool of souls apparently according to Crowley. I believe what I think that these spirits are that are being implemented into a gestating homunculus, a baby, and according to Crowley. Now, he goes on to say a human being can only become homunculus if obsessed by a demon to such an extent that the human soul is expelled to the same degree as in death and freed utterly so that it seeks a new tenement and is cut off absolutely from the old. So basically, You're trying to deter the human soul from connecting to the fetus, and you want to implement it with something else. Now, he's saying it's another soul. Don't really buy into that, specifically when we get later on into what he says that you have to have with you. Now, he goes on to talk about the gestation period in the child of 4.5 months, weighing 9 ounces, has been known to live for over an hour after delivery. And he says that's encouraging in the idea of being able to pull the homunculus out early. And he even quotes the Bible, which is even crazier. With God, all things are possible. And then he says, is not our motto, do este homo, talking about a homunculus. Now, what you have to do, you have to remove the child, and then you're going to put this in a tincture. You got to create a liquor amnii. Now, if you know anything about the liquor amnii, it's a Latin term for amniotic fluid. So you're creating your own amniotic fluid for this homunculus that you're removing from the woman. It's very interesting now, because when we get into alien abductions later on this episode and alien hybrids and the removal of these hybrid babies and what is said that these gray aliens or interdimensional beings are doing with them, sounds a lot like what these alchemists were also doing. Now, he talks about the white tincture of the alchemist is the replica of the amniotic fluid, and the red tincture is a substitute for blood. Now, if you know anything about alchemy, we know that the philosopher's stone is generally talked about as being white and red. And that is also representation of different stages of the great work or the magnum opus, because we know that the white stone, when we're talking about precious metals being transmuted, will transmute base metals into silver, while the red stone will create gold. But we also know that these philosopher's stones are also representation of something even more spiritual, that it's more of a liquid. It's more of something that will help you yourself transcend. So the idea that you've got a white tincture that represents the amniotic fluid and the red tincture that represents blood also plays into the philosopher's stone. You are creating a great work. You're creating life without having to have the normal God-given creation process. Now, he actually goes on to talk about, for about 3 months, the fetus is empty of any soul. It then attracts an ego of such a nature as its own karma, natura, and tendency, and the karma of the ego combine to make viable. If a suitable combination is not found, the result is either miscarriage, stillbirth, or the birth of an idiot. So he's saying that if a suitable soul is not attached to this body by the time that it is 3 months, the fetus, then one of those 3 things will happen. Again, according to Crowley, we're not saying that this is true. We're just saying how Crowley's talking about how to create this homunculus. And he says, in the last case, the fetus has been obsessed by some dumb non-human spirit or by some human spirit of exceptional karma. By karma, we mean always nature and tendency and no more, although we use these words in a large sense to include all causes, moral as well as physical. But we include not conceptions of justice and the like in these. If this be accepted, then clearly it's possible that a magician might find means to bar the gate against any human ego and to cause the incarnation of some non-human being, such as an elemental or planetary spirit of a nature fitted to some desired end. Thus, one eloquent from the incarnation of Tyrael, this is an angel, or one bold in war from the indwelling of Graphael. And these will be his chief difficulties, that man, even when discarnate, is so spiritually powerful that to bar him from his urgent need is a task of colossal awe, and it is necessary to choose a spirit suitable to the fetus. Thus, if the babe is to be by reason of physical heredity, sluggish, melancholy, and weak, it would be but nugatory to invoke into a spirit of Nakael or Raphael or Haniel or Aniel. So he's even talking about if the fetus has been taken over by some dumb non-human spirit. According to Crowley, you bring in these angels and you're able to invoke a spirit into it to change that entire makeup of the homunculus, of the fetus. And this is the idea, and it's the theme of Moonchild, and it's part of this magical process of being able to invoke whatever soul or whatever spirit you want into the fetus. And the idea of possession by these negative spirits, and we would attribute them to episode 1 of this, where we're talking about the spirits of the Nephilim that are looking for host bodies. It makes perfect sense. And it also makes perfect sense, according to Crowley, that you need angels on deck when you're doing this. So again, he talks about the human soul is all but expungible. So he knows that if a human soul gets there first, that they're not going to be able to complete the process of what soul they want to implement into this, essentially a meat sack, right? And he goes on to talk more about you need to find a suitable woman who will aid thee in this work. You're going to have a human uterus, which is definitely different than what Paracelsus was talking about and the Liber Vacae was talking about. Again, there's multiple ways of doing this throughout history, but according to Crowley, you need a suitable woman. And this is why this same technique comes up with Parsons and his Scarlet Woman, Marjorie Cameron, and then L. Ron Hubbard when they were out in the desert trying to complete the Babylon working, which was to bring what? A moon child into this earth. And that is exactly what Crowley talks about specifically in not only Liber 367, but his book Moonchild as well. So we will talk more as we get into now more of the UFO alien phenomena on what I think these homunculi in this setting are, right? I do think there's different kinds, but in this setting, and at the end of this, we're going to talk about exactly what a Nephilim Portal Baby actually is too. We're going to switch gears a little bit. We're going to get into the Majestic 12. And I know that Isaac Weishaupt did a fantastic job on our Occult World 1947 of breaking down the Majestic 12. I'm going to go briefly over it again for new listeners, but I'm going to really focus in on 2 projects, Project Sigma and Project Plato here, which we didn't go into detail during that because Project Sigma and Plato are essential in talking about this modern idea of alien contact and alien abduction and what that means to this theory of Nephilim Portal Babies. So Majestic 12, also known as Magic 12, MJ12 for short, it's an organization, again, according to mainstream, appeared in fake documents that were circulated by ufologists in 1984. Now, we do know that Bill Cooper talks about it specifically in Behold a Pale Horse, and we will talk about what he thinks about that here too, specifically when it comes to Project Sigma and Plato. But it was said to have been started by Harry S. Truman, and he was the 33rd, remember that number, 33rd president of the United States, and he served from 1945 to 1953, and this was during the Roswell incident of 1947. Again, it's essential. Go back and listen to Occult World 1947. We talk about all the weird stuff that happens in 1947, and Harry S. Truman is at the forefront of dealing with all that. And he brought along the National Security Act, which brought in the unification of all the military departments, and it brought the NSC, the National Security Council, and the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, which is all integrated into all of this too. Even though the Majestic 12 is said to be the super secret agency behind all of it, Central Intelligence Agency is also going to be a proxy working for them as well. Also, Harry S. Truman was a Freemason. I know we talked about that a little bit during the Occult World series, but I'm going to go a little bit further. He was dedicated and prominent Freemason. There are plenty of pictures of him wearing his Freemasonic garb, and he joined in 1909, and he rose to become Grand Master of Missouri in 1940, and he received the 33rd degree of Scottish Rite, and he found that the fraternity was a vital source of moral guidance, leadership experience, and social support throughout his life. Of course it did. Became president of the United States. Of course it was social support. So in leading more towards the Majestic 12, we know that Timothy Good, and he's a British author on UFOs. Probably a lot of people have heard of him. He's written a lot of books. Above Top Secret, the Worldwide UFO Cover-Up was where he really brought into the zeitgeist the Majestic 12. He was one of the first ones to start talking about it. He was involved in the initial publication of the purported Majestic 12 documents. Now, there were plenty of people that were skeptical, and even Good was skeptical to some point, but he did bring them to the forefront. Also, we know that there were other ufologists like William L. Moore and his friend, Los Angeles television writer-producer Jamie Shandera, and they received documents that were briefing papers that were also describing Operation Majestic 12. Now, what Majestic 12 is, it's a secret committee of 12, and they were formed after the 1947 crash at Roswell, and this was to understand how to deal with alien threats, how to communicate with them, how to use their technology to reverse engineer into projects that we wanted to. And again, we're going to talk specifically about what Bill Cooper has to say about Project Sigma and Plato, because that's very important to what we're going to talk about today. It's that connection between the divine and human to then be able to move mankind forward in whatever manner they want to. And you may say, well, this isn't very divine. Well, Bill Cooper actually talks about how divine it is in his book. Now, we know later on the 34th president of the United States, Dwight D. Eisenhower, came along, and he also took on the Majestic 12, which he then changed the name to the Majority 12. And that was by a secret executive memorandum, NSC 5410, and it was to establish a permanent committee which would oversee and conduct all covert activities concerned with alien question. Now, this is when you see some of these other names come into play, like CIA Alan Welch Dulles, Secretary of State John Foster Dulles. We've got Secretary of Defense Charles E. Wilson, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Admiral Arthur W. Radford, Director of FBI J. Edgar Hoover. And then there were 6 men from the Executive Committee of the Council of Foreign Relations. They were known as the Wise Men. And this spawned into the Jason Society, which we talked about, and the Jason Scholars, which were recruited from the Skull and Bones and Scroll and Key societies of Harvard and Yale. We also know that there were other guys brought on board, Gordon Dean, George Bush. We know that George Kennan. We know Charles Bolin, John McCloy. All of these guys served as MJ-12. Now, what's very interesting about Eisenhower, which is very similar to Truman, he was also a Freemason. He was initiated in 1951 by the Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania. And then he later petitioned the State College Lodge number 700. And he took his oath of office during his presidency using a Bible that George Washington first used in his inauguration. And this Bible is associated with presidents who were Freemasons. And we've all seen the painting of George Washington in his full Masonic garb, and he has his hand up and he is being sworn into the presidency. So he made sure it was that same Bible. So again, these guys are Freemasons. And this is that tie that I'm bringing in from the last episode when we talked about Legends of the Craft and why this is important. Why, when we track the Legends of the Craft all the way back to Cain and his son Enoch, and then Lamech, and then Tubal-Cain and Jubal and Jabal, and how that the knowledge that was gifted to them from these fallen angels, that they passed this all the way down, where here we are with the guys that it was passed down to, and they are now in contact with these alien entities. So let's get to what they were doing according to Bill Cooper and what they've done that would have ramifications on how we are dealing with the UFO and alien phenomena today. So Project Sigma and Plato, through radio communications, were using binary language. They were able to arrange a landing that resulted in face-to-face contact with alien beings from another planet. Project Plato was tasked with establishing diplomatic relations. So they were the diplomatic branch of the Majestic 12, whereas Project Sigma was more about retrieving radio communications and trying to implement what we needed to get out to whatever was out in the universe. So while this is going on, a race of human-like aliens contacted the U.S. government. This group warned us against the aliens that were orbiting the equator and offered to help us with our spiritual development. Now, check this out. So now you've got this human-looking aliens, which probably plays more into the Nordics, and this ties into more of the Vrilya, this very Nephilim type, tall, blonde hair, sometimes blue eyes. And they contacted the U.S. government saying that there was this evil group that was orbiting the equator, and they're offering to help us with our what? Spiritual development. Why are they trying to help us with spiritual development? If evolution is true and we came from nothing, there is no God, why are these aliens who are far more advanced than us always trying to help us with our spiritual development? These aliens refused to exchange technology, citing that we were spiritually unable to handle the technology when we possessed it. They believe we would use any technology to destroy each other. And they also stated that we were on a path of self-destruction and we must stop killing each other, stop polluting the earth, stop messing with Earth's natural resources, and learn to live in harmony. So because of these terms, we do not decide to go forward with this supposedly nice group of more humanoid-looking aliens because we don't want to get rid of our nuclear weapons, and we've decided to reject their advancements of trying to help us spiritually. So then, in 1954, this race of large-nosed gray aliens, which apparently was orbiting the Earth, they landed at Holloman Air Force Base. So there was a basic agreement reached, and they said they were from the Red Star in the constellation of Orion. And they claimed that their planet was dying. We've heard this a million times with a million different alien groups since the alien phenomena came along. And they said they wouldn't be able to survive there. And this led to a second connection at Edwards Air Force Base. And Eisenhower arranged to meet them there, and they form a formal treaty between the alien nation and United States of America. And they give us their first alien ambassador, the Omnipotent Highness Krill. And I found it interesting. Krill is also an alien that is in the Marvel Comics universe, not only in the comics, but also in the movies and shows, and they are a shape-shifting race of aliens. So it's very interesting. And here's this Krill who Bill Cooper talks about that met with the Majestic 12 and Eisenhower specifically. And we are now seeing this pop up in pop culture later on. So the agreement, this treaty that we made, is the aliens would not interfere in our affairs and we would not interfere in theirs. We would keep their presence on Earth a secret, but they would furnish us with advanced technology, here we go, and help us in our technological development. And they would not make any treaty with any other Earth nation. So again, this is supposedly only to the people who met here. Now, there were other countries that met. It wasn't just the U.S., but this was specifically a U.S. thing. But the aliens could abduct humans on a limited and periodic basis for the purpose of medical examination and monitoring of our development, with the stipulations that humans would not be harmed, but we returned to the point of their abduction. The humans would have no memory of the event, that the alien nation would furnish MJ-12 with a list of all human contacts and abductees on a regular scheduled basis. We didn't necessarily believe that because, according to Bill Cooper, we were always building contingencies in place, but we're allowing them to do this. But then they were giving us alien guests that were allowed to stay in our underground bases in Utah, New Mexico, Arizona, and Colorado underneath Indian reservations, again, according to Bill Cooper. And we were allowed to do tests on all these different alien types. So not only were they testing us when they had abducted us, we were doing the same. And it also plays into the earlier part where we talked about EBE, the extraterrestrial biological entity that Dr. Vannevar Bush, who was a part of the Majestic 12, supposedly talked about as well. And this was one of the gray aliens that lived from the Roswell crash, that stayed alive for a few years. And he lied to us all the time, shocker. But we figured out his makeup was very similar to plants and that he used chlorophyll to survive. And even though Dr. Guillermo Mendoza, who was a botanist at the time, who worked on him, was able to keep him alive for another year and a half. He ended up passing away anyway. But not long after that was when we had this connection. The Majestic 12 did with these larger grays and this omnipotent highness Krill, who we made this pact with, supposedly. So again, interesting. We got all these Freemasons who are making pacts with quote unquote aliens to give us what? Technology and access to some of their people. In exchange, we're giving them our people. Now, the aliens said that they were letting us know about all the abductions they were doing. Absolutely do not believe that at all. And I know that according to Bill Cooper, he said that the U.S. didn't believe them either, but this was a pact because we wanted to get access to this technology so bad that we were willing to do whatever. And that reminds me so much of the Book of Enoch and the Watchers and Mount Hermon and the pact that man made with these entities back then to get technology as well from Azazel and Barakael and Ezekiel and all of these other ones, right? So it's almost verbatim the same playbook. Now we slide right into the grays, and some people know them as Zeta Reticulans. The Roswell grays are the grays. And most people, I think, listen to this show know what they look like. Small bodies, gray skin, hairless heads, large black eyes. You know, what's interesting when people talk about demonology and demons, even from the past, they look a lot like these. And we know one of our first modern depictions was from Aleister Crowley when he met with Lamb during the Amalanche workings in 1917. And in Tibetan, Lamb means the way. And again, we don't know a whole lot outside of the fact he passed this drawing on to Kenneth Grant, which then Kenneth Grant created the cult of Lamb out of, which I've talked about already. But it's interesting that the early occultists looked at these beings not as extraterrestrials. They looked at them as interdimensional beings. They looked at them as entities that were in line with the Great White Brotherhood, things that could help us ascend. So this is more of a modern take now that these are extraterrestrials that are giving us technology. And I believe they're giving us technology. It's just with nefarious strings attached. And one of the really first well-known abduction instances, and we're going to talk about this briefly, is the Barney and Betty Hill extraterrestrial abductions. And Barney and Betty Hill lived in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and Barney was a World War II veteran, and he's employed by the United States Postal Service, and Betty was a social worker. And it was kind of interesting for that time period because Barney was a black man and Betty was a white woman, and that was very uncommon in the United States at that time. However, they got along great in the community they were in. So it was very interesting, again, for that time period. So the actual story, the first story, takes place on September 19th, 1961 at 10:30 p.m. And the Hills are driving back to Portsmouth from a vacation in Niagara Falls and Montreal. And what they saw was it looked like a star falling, but they noticed that it was moving erratically and it got bigger and bigger. And then Betty was looking through her binoculars and she observed an odd shaped craft flashing multicolored lights. It looked like a pancake from both of their accounts. And they started driving down this quiet and isolated road, and this craft gets closer and closer and closer to him, to the point that Barney actually stops the car and gets out. And when he does, he uses the binoculars and he says he saw 8 to 11 humanoid figures peering out of the craft's windows to look at him. So all of them but one figure moved to what appeared to be a panel on the rear wall of the hallway that encircled the front portion of the craft. And then the one figure that kept looking at him communicated telepathically, "Stay where you are and keep looking." So then he remembers these humanoid forms coming out of the craft. And there's a point where fears his life that he's going to be captured, and he starts to run back to his car, and they get in the car and they start speeding away. But then they hear this strange beeping sound and they fall into a daze. So when they wake up, now they're outside of Concord. So he reports on October 21st, 1961, to the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomenon that the beings were somehow not human. So they get home at dawn the next day, a huge gap of time missing. And when they get into the house, for some reason, Barney says he feels compelled to check his genitalia, which lends to me thinking something was going on there that he couldn't quite wrap his mind around. He notices that his shoes are scraped. They notice weird things aren't right. Their memories are incomplete and fragmented. They notice that the car has weird scratches on it, weird indentations. There's these concentric circles on the back of the trunk of the car. And 10 days after this encounter, Betty begins having all these vivid dreams, and she remembers walking with these entities, but she is trying to talk to Barney, but Barney's in a daze, and she feels like he's in a trance or sleepwalk, but these grayish colored entities, these grays, are moving them along. Now, they did say they both were wearing clothes, these military cadet clothes, which I find interesting, blue uniforms. And in these dreams, which she believes are details of what happened, she says she remembers when they were taken back to their car and the leader of these grays tells them to watch the craft's departure. And then they made their way back home. So they actually drove in this daze, and they just remember waking up in Concord. So they go through a lot of different things, hypnotic regression, and they both remember more terrifying depictions of these things being inside of their brains. Barney remembers more physical activity, even though he can't wrap his mind around all of it. Some of it seems very sexual in nature. What's interesting is when Barney dies in 1969, she actually claims to also have seen hundreds of sightings. But then she starts attributing a lot of this to psychic powers, reincarnation, ghosts, and life after death. All of these things start coming to the forefront after this alien abduction, after she starts seeing all of these UFOs after this alien abduction. So I find it interesting that there's this spiritual component, even with this, even with Barney and Betty Hill, specifically Betty, who after Barney's death seemed to have a huge uptick in a lot of this activity. Now, I'm going to talk about John Keel a little bit because he's got some interesting things to say about aliens and what he thinks they might be. Now, John Alva Keel, he was an American journalist and influential ufologist who was best known as the author of the Mothman Prophecies. And I've talked about Keel plenty of times on this show, but we're going to talk about some things that he said specifically about the UFO phenomenon and its connection to demonology. So he says millions of people have been affected at least temporarily by UFO contact, and thousands have gone insane and ended up in mental institutions after their experiences with these, when these things began. So he's even talking about verbatim that, you know, something's not right. People are not doing well after these abductions. He even goes on to say the UFOs do not seem to exist as tangible manufactured objects. They do not conform to the natural laws of our environment. They seem to be nothing more than transmogrifications, tailoring themselves to our abilities and to understand. So these entities are tailoring how they communicate with us to how we communicate. It's not that they're coming with their communication form. No, they're morphing even physically into something that we can accept. And I'm telling you now, I said this from the get-go, why do they always look like us in some format? If they were from some other planet with a different biology, with a different atmosphere, all of those things, they would look nothing like us. They would be completely different. And that's the big issue I have with the idea that these aliens, quote unquote, are actually aliens or from outer space. I believe in more of the interdimensional aspect of this. Now, Keel also says that thousands of contacts with the entities indicate that they are liars and put on artists. Of course, they're liars because they want us to believe them. And they also want to take our eyes off of Jesus and God for some odd reason. Here's these highly advanced beings, but you know, that means so much to them in every conversation. UFO manifestations seem to be by and large merely minor variations of the age-old demonological phenomenon. Officialdom may feel that if we ignore them long enough, they will go away altogether, taking their place of the vampire myths of the Middle Ages. No, because the vampire myths of the Middle Ages are all tied into this too. So it's just the new format. It's just the iPhone update of what demonology has always been throughout time. Even Jacques Vallée talks about, I pointed out in Invisible College that the structure of abduction stories was identical to that of occult rituals. I'd shown in Passport to Magonia that contacts with euphonauts was only a modern extension of contact with non-human consciousness in the form of angels, demons, elves, and sylphs. Such contacts includes abduction, ordeal, including surgical operations and sexual intercourse with the aliens. It often leaves marks and scars on the body and the mind, as do UFO abductions. So again, one of the brightest minds when it comes to what's going on with the UFO phenomena, Jacques Vallée, is also stating that it's identical to what happens after these occult rituals throughout history. And I don't know how people can't put two and two together when it comes to this, specifically with these grays. And Nigel Watson goes in a little bit further, and we're talking about the physical interaction between these entities and humankind. And he's researched and investigated historical and contemporary reports of UFO sightings since the 1970s. And he's written in a monthly column called Saucers of the Damned about UFOs for Fortean Times. And he's written tons of books about UFOs. And he wrote this book called Screwed by Aliens. And it's literally about what you think it means. And he talks about a story of the first case of sexual contact in the flying saucer area was by Antonio Villas Boas in South America. And so Boas claimed in 1947 he was dragged inside of a flying saucer and forced to have intercourse with a beautiful alien woman. And he said when he left, she pointed at her stomach and at him and then the sky, implying she would have his child somewhere in outer space. And this is very important to where we're going to get with this Nephilim Portal Baby thing and why that this would be somewhere else. In the 1980s, alien abduction researchers in the USA accepted that women are routinely abducted, impregnated, and then re-abducted a few weeks later for the extraction of the hybrid fetus. These activities explain the short-lived pregnancies experienced by female abductees. And this is where you hear where female abductees will remember being pregnant and then no one else does. And then the child's removed and then they have no proof of this child. Outside of the fact, some of these women will go to the doctor and the doctor will say, well, it looks like you're pregnant. You must have had a miscarriage. Everything is working like it should if you were pregnant. Where's the baby? You must have had a miscarriage. And these women think they're going crazy. And we're going to move to Brad Steiger, and I've talked about Steiger a lot. And Steiger is the one who wrote the book, The Star People, and I've talked about him extensively when I broke down the dark origins of star seeds. And he was an American writer of fiction and nonfiction works on the paranormal, spirituality, UFOs, true crime, and biographies. And he was a big proponent of Atlantis as well. But he talks about an account of a Krista Tilton, and she reveals the details of being a surrogate mother to aliens, many. And this also ties into the parallel nature of reptilian reproduction as we know it on Earth. And she was basically a gestating point for these alien beings. And this was all covered by Brad Steiger. Dr. Carla Turner, and she focused on the psychology and ethics of those allegedly saying that they've been abducted, visited, probed, and tormented by extraterrestrial beings. And she wrote plenty of books on this. She said that deception was often used by these alien kind to make the abductee a willing sexual partner. So all these people she interviewed were saying that they would shapeshift into celebrities or someone that they knew that the abductee would find attractive. And they would even go as far as to creating perversions of the child kind and animal kind in with this and force their abductees to do these things. So again, how we're not putting two and two together, these aliens not being really aliens and more of the demonic entities that we've heard about throughout the centuries. So we got another interesting story by a Giovanna Pata, and she's an Italian woman, and she came forth in 2010, and she came through as this really bizarre abduction story. So she said since age 4 that she had been abducted numerous times, inseminated 18 times. And she said at 2 months, the aliens would come back, remove the fetuses, and then grow them in laboratory test tubes. What does that sound like? We were just talking about the homunculus. We were talking about using a fake amniotic fluid to grow them in. I know that L.A. Marzulli has suggested that bovine blood, and this goes into the cattle mutilations and why the cattle are found with no blood in them, that bovine blood is being used as a part of this concoction as well, since bovine blood is the closest to human blood there is. I think it's an interesting concept, specifically when it comes to these hybrids. And she did claim to use her cell phone to take a lot of pictures of these gray aliens and some of them reptilians. I've seen some of the pictures. I mean, yeah, we don't know if they're true or not. It could be all a ruse. It could be all fake. I mean, she seems that she has had these experiences, but we'll never know about pictures. Again, we could be looking dead at something that's real. And especially in this day and age, we'll look at it and say it's fake. And probably a lot of it is, you know what I mean? But then again, we don't know. And I think that's the biggest ruse, specifically with AI now. And I don't want to go off on a whole rant about AI, but I think it's been created to also mask things that we see that could be real, that we will immediately say is fake because of the ability to create through AI things that do look real. And she said that the reason that the aliens said they needed to do this, they were unable to reproduce themselves as a result of genetic abnormalities. And they needed other human females for use in breeding research to conserve their species. And they found that the human race was genetically compatible with their race. Well, why is that? Out of every planet in the universe, somehow this one planet is got the thing that you need, and you just happen to look a lot like us. Come on, man. Come on. It's a ruse. And it's always hybrid species. They're creating a hybrid. Well, what do we know about hybrids? The Nephilim, we know this. And I believe that there is a new Nephilim being created. And I think that that idea, and we're going to rope this all the way back into the first episode now, and then I'm going to break down what I think, at least an idea of something that I think. Look at the Book of Enoch, and we need to talk about what happened to those watchers after they performed what they did. Now we're going to look at chapter 6 first. And it came to pass when children of men had multiplied in those days, were born unto them beautiful and comely daughters. And the angels, the children of heaven, saw and lusted after them and said one to another, come, let us choose us wives from among the children of men and beget us children. And Simjaza, who was their leader, said unto them, I fear you will not indeed agree to do this, and I alone shall have to pay the penalty of a great sin. And they all answered him and said, let us all swear an oath and all bind ourselves by mutual imprecations not to abandon this plan, but to do this thing. Then swear they all together and bound themselves by mutual imprecations upon it. And they were in all 200 who descended in the days of Jared on the summit of Mount Hermon, and they called it Mount Hermon because they had sworn and bound themselves by mutual imprecations upon it. So this is when the watchers, this is the 200 fallen angels, make a pact that they're going to take these women as wives, and they are going to commit the sin and have these Nephilim. So now we're going to jump ahead to chapter 10. Then said the Most High, this is Yahweh, this is God, the Holy and Great One spake and sent Uriel, one of the good angels, to the son of Lamech and said to him, now this is of Seth's line, Lamech. We're not talking about Lamech with Jubal Jabal, Tubal Cain. This is a different Lamech. Go to Noah and tell him in my name, hide thyself and reveal to him the end that is approaching, that the whole earth will be destroyed and that a deluge is about to come upon the whole earth and will destroy all that is on it. And now instruct him that he may escape and his seed may be preserved for all the generations of the world. And again, the Lord said to Raphael, another good angel, bind Azazel hand and foot and cast him into the darkness and make an opening in the desert, which is in Dudio, and cast him therein. And place upon him rough and jagged rocks and cover him with darkness and let him abide there forever. Cover his face that he may not see light. And on the day of great judgment, he shall be cast into the fire. And we can jump forward to verse 11. The Lord said to Michael, another good angel, go bind Simjaza and his associates who have united themselves with women so as to have defiled themselves with them in all their uncleanliness. Verse 13. In those days they shall be led off to the abyss of fire and to the torment and prison in which they shall be confined forever. And whosoever shall be condemned and destroyed will from thenceforth be bound together with them to the end of all generations. So the Bible describes certain groups of fallen angels being locked up. It's interesting, though, that Azazel is done a little bit different in the Book of Enoch than Simjaza and the rest of them. So he is dropped in the desert in Dudio, and he is essentially locked up underground, whereas the other watchers, Simjaza and the other 198, are cast into the abyss of fire. They're in this lake of fire. And this also plays into biblical verses too. So we know in 2 Peter 2:4, for if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell and committed them to chains of gloomy darkness to be kept until the judgment. So these are the ones that sinned by taking the women and committing these unspeakable acts against God. Jude 1:6, and the angels who did not stay within their own position of authority or their first estate, but left their proper dwelling, he is reserved in eternal chains under darkness for judgment on the great day. So this is another verse that is talking about these watchers who committed these atrocities. We have now gone through all of the different machinations. So now we're going to get to what I think, one, is going on with these gray aliens. And this will lead into this Nephilim Portal Baby theory of mine. And again, this is a theory. It's not a fact. It's just my concept. And it could be wrong, or part of it could be right, or all of it could be right, but there could be a whole other angle that's going on at the same time too, because I don't necessarily believe all grays are the same. I think fallen angels could masquerade as grays, as well as there being different formats of grays, just like I think Bigfoot could be several different things too. Same thing. This is just works within confines of this theory. So again, you don't have to take this on board if you don't like it, but it is the culmination of a lot of research I've done into what I think. So I think that gray aliens are a form of homunculus. I think that they are a form of a moonchild. I'm not saying all moonchildren or all homunculi are the same. I'm saying this specific kind. They are essentially a meat sack to house a Nephilim spirit who is looking for a host body, because a Nephilim spirit would work for a fallen angel. In saying that, it plays into the fact people with alien abductions or alien encounters, when they see them, they look cold. They look almost mechanical at times. They don't seem real. And even though that they have a physical makeup of skin and eyes, and even when they touch them, they're cold to the touch. They don't feel like they're all there. And they're also operating at a spiritual level. They're talking through telepathy. They're levitating people. They're performing supernatural acts that they attribute to some sort of higher form of evolution. But I believe that these are, at least this particular kind, is a homunculus that has been created to house these Nephilim spirits. So what is a Nephilim Portal Baby though? So you need the grays to come and get the women and men to procure either semen from a man or the womb from a woman. And you hear this more in the women area of the population with this stuff happening, which lends more towards the Book of Enoch and what we know happened there. So I think that these grays are the capturers for these fallen entities. I'm not saying fallen entities couldn't show up, couldn't operate the same way, but I am saying though that this is part of the loophole. And you say, what loophole? Well, I believe that fallen angels are some of the best lawyers in the universe. They know all the ins and outs of the Bible. They know all the ins and outs of God's sacred geometry, the real sacred geometry, not this Gnostic occult viewpoint of what it is, because we know that the entire universe is built in a format of geometry that God has placed on it. They know all the ins and outs of it. They know the loopholes. And one of the things that happens in the Book of Enoch and in the Bible that we know, that the angels that left their first estate, the ones that cross the line, that have these Nephilim, marry these women, have sex with these women, that they are thrown into the pit. So the big question has always been, after the flood, how did the Nephilim reappear? Well, there's several different ways, and I think it could be all of them too. I don't think it's necessarily one. Now, I know people really lend to the idea of the second incursion. Well, if God is known to throw angel kind into the pit for crossing this line, and they know this has already happened to 199 watchers, we're throwing Azazel out of there because he had a whole different thing that happened to him. 199 watchers get thrown into the pit of fire. It's where they're kept right now. Wouldn't angel kind think through that a little bit before they did it again? Now, again, there could be some angel kind that are kamikazes that the Satan sends out and says, you know what, you're just going to take the hit, man. Go do it to disrupt God's creation. You're going to go to the pit. You're already doomed anyway. Maybe. But I would think they would be a little bit smarter than that. They know they do this here on earth, they go to the pit. So how do they operate around that? Well, first off, you send out an emissary. You send out these meat sack grays that are houses for these Nephilim spirits that are working for these fallen entities. They bring the women to them, sometimes men, obviously, to procure what they need from the man, but generally women. I have thought about this in what would be the loophole? Don't do it here on earth. Do it in a different dimension. If you could move into a different dimension, which we know that we see these craft move in and out of dimensions, we know we see these grays move in and out of dimensions. They're interdimensional beings. If they're moving interdimensionally, then they would pull the abductees into another dimension to then allow these angelic beings to perform these acts, whether it's an actual sexual act, whether it's a perversion of a sexual act, whether it is the scientific DNA splicing that's going on. I think that there is a interdimensional component to all this, that they are finding a way to do this in an interdimensional space, that way that they can escape the initial wrath of God, right? So we got the long-term effects that's going to happen because they're going to go away forever at some point anyway. But they can do this initially so that they can still operate here on earth. So you are creating these hybrids in this interdimensional space. You're sending these women back 2-3 months. You bring them back and you remove the portal baby because they are being created in a portal realm. They're being born in this portal realm. And you may ask, what are they doing? Where are they at? Well, you could say that they start reappearing as we get closer to the end of time. And we may see a major uptick of Nephilim hybrids at some point. I'm not saying anytime soon. I have no idea when the end of time's coming, guys. I'm not here to sow fear either. But I do think that what they are trying to do with these Nephilim now is make them more like us, albeit with supernatural powers, but maybe not so much on the giant side. Again, they could still be creating giants too. And if we're looking at something like Armageddon in the future, then I believe there could very well be giants and chimeras and all kinds of hybrids that would be a part of that. I'm not going to throw that out of the realm of possibility at all, but I think that to sell mankind on some sort of mark or something that they would take, you would want to become something better than what you already are. And if you're looking at something that is able to look like you, but operate at a completely different spiritual and supernatural level, and you could become that if you take this, well, that would be your prototype that you would put in front of people. And I think that is what possibly being created in these other realms. And that, my friends, is what a Nephilim Portal Baby is. I hope you guys had a blast with this. I've had a really fun time revisiting all of this and really going so much deeper than I ever did before. And I'm glad I was able to really expound on this so you guys could see what you think about it. You might not like it at all, and that's cool. At least you got all the other research that I've done for the past 3 episodes that holds a lot of weight. But all that research did bring me into this concept of a Nephilim Portal Baby. And if you want to get some Nephilim Portal Baby merch, you can go to freetherabbits.myshopify.com, and I've got plenty of Nephilim Portal Babies merch up there now. That way, when you rock it and somebody says, what is that? You can tell them all this cool stuff or even point them to the series. Guys, I love you all so much. If you've been listening to the show and you haven't gone to Apple Podcast, or if you haven't gone to Spotify to give me a 5-star review, please go do that now. If you're on Apple Podcast, you can even write a review. All of that helps the show get deeper into the algorithm and lets more people be able to find it, which you guys have been doing such a great job because so many people have been finding the show that it wasn't even shared to them. They just happened to find it in the algorithm. So if you can, guys, go do that now. If you're on YouTube, please go comment below, like, share, subscribe, all of the good stuff that you should do if you like the show. On the way out, guys, we're going to play my song, Joel's Psalm, and you know what it is, guys. Go outside, touch grass, and get your tail out the hole.
feel alone. Who can heal me? I feel I'm wrong. Who gon' feel me? They say I'm supposed to feel you in me, but I feel lost. I feel lost. I feel lost. I feel raw. The tears are mixed with the ink on this page from this song. Cannonballs to this cesspool, and you know I'ma need you today. And you know I'ma need you today. Oh yeah, you. These parts are lonely, but these parts don't know me. I'm not alone with you. I'm not alone with you. I'm not alone with you. Substituting the pain like I'm pumping aspartame on my veins while I'm numbing these pieces of me. What I create in these songs, and the pain is cold but seasonally. I'm crying looking for signs, I need a theophany. Everything encompassing me isotropically, and nothing I seem to do is working out. Who is spotting me? I feel like they're mocking me. Where is the God in me? I feel like I'm dried up hominy, and all I want is Christ, not theology. People are nitpicking, bickering over the Bible while people are dying in front of them. And you wonder why people are running from the guy that you say that is shunning them. I felt it myself. They told me to look somewhere he's not. Up in the stars, up in the sky, up in the clouds like he's not around. So I empty myself with every distraction. Got dry by my tires, a ball can't get any traction. Where's compassion? We following kings, but they only from Akron. Whoa. I just know that we're more than what they tell us. We're overzealous when we protect what is precious. We get confused when those things start to propel us into things we don't want to do, leave us helpless. There's only one who gives us peace when we are restless. I know that now.